Hey friends, welcome back to the Journal Feed. My name is Nick Zelt, and this is the only place where I get to spoon feed you guys the latest and greatest of emergency medicine. Now, this is the audio version of our past week summaries, which this week were brought to you by our authors, Clark Strunk, Shannon Marcus, Amanda Matthews, Ketan Patel, and Clay Smith. Okay, so let's get straight into the first article, which was titled Preoxygenation Strategies for Intubation of Patients Who Are Critically Ill. A systematic review and network meta-analysis of randomized trials out of the Lancet. Now, I think that preoxygenation has been the talk of the town since Preoxy trial came out, because it's really made people think a little bit more about what the best preoxygenation strategies are. We've always thought a little bit about this because it is an important step, because we want to remove as much nitrogen from those lungs as we can and fill it up with oxygen to give the patients the most time possible to not have hypoxemia and hopefully not have complications. However, how certain are we really? We really shouldn't be changing our practice just based on preoxy. So this trial wanted to do a meta-analysis, a network meta-analysis, to see if non-invasive positive pressure ventilation was really all it's hyped up to be. Or could we do something a little bit simpler, like high-flow nasal cannulas, which would be a lot easier for us to implement. And then we can compare these kind of new kids on the block to a face mask, which is sort of standard and everyone can manage at least that. And why is all this important? Well, nearly 10% of critically ill patients who are getting intubated have hypoxia at some point during their intubation. And preoxygenation is a crucial preparatory step to try to avoid that. And I mean, when I think about oxygenation, there's two parameters, at least in an intubated patient or anyone really, that you can control in order to better oxygenate your patients. You can increase the FiO2, but we're going to try to have that at 100%, and you can pretty much reach that with high-flow nasal cannula. So between non-invasive positive pressure and high-flow nasal cannula, not a huge difference there. Unless you're just really mouth breathing, then maybe you could get away with not as good FiO2, not sure. However, the other parameter that you want to increase to improve oxygenation is PEEP. And nothing's going to give you PEEP except for something that actually provides pressure. And high-flow nasal cannula, not really giving you PEEP. A non-invasive mask, though, that's going to give you PEEP. So Preoxy showed us that non-invasive, well, it was pretty good, but it didn't compare it to high-flow. So how did the two actually compare? These authors were able to find 15 RCTs, which total about 3,400 patients. Honestly, it was kind of weird, actually. About half those trials are from France, interestingly enough. But what they found was that non-invasive, it reduced the rates of hypoxemia compared to high-flow nasal cannula, a risk ratio of 0.73, which was significant. High-flow was even better than just preoxygenating with a face mask, a risk ratio of 0.51 for hypoxemia. To be fair, high-flow nasal cannulas also were better than a face mask by a risk ratio of 0.63, so not as good, which makes sense because non-invasive was significantly better than high-flow. Now, of course, while we want our patients to be well oxygenated as much as possible, what matters more are things like all-cause mortality, and there was no significant difference there. There was also no difference in first-pass success rates, but I wouldn't expect you to have a different difficulty in intubating just based on your preoxygenation strategy. The only other outcome was the rates of serious adverse events, and they seemed to be lower with non-invasive. It was less certain whether they were lower with high flow. Thus, the only high certainty finding seems to be that both high flow and non-invasive are better than face masks, at least with rates of hypoxemia. But of course, that's kind of a monitored oriented outcome, which is unfortunate because we want things that really actually benefit our patients. There was even a trial that actually tried both methods. So you had a non-invasive mask on, and then when you took that off to intubate, you put on high flow during the intubation, which I'd say is great, but that would be a lot to sort of mess around with. And switching between the two, it'd be kind of complicated. I'd really want a respiratory therapist there to help me with that because that's going to be a lot of stuff to move around. And it wasn't shown to be any more beneficial, and it was just one trial that had done this, but still interesting, thought-provoking. So while we're finding positive findings like this, you can expect that some guidelines are definitely going to be updated. As of yet, things are still a bit mixed in the guidelines. And obviously, I don't have to tell that many of you, all of this is for resource-rich environments only, essentially. If it's just you and one nurse, you're probably not going to have the manpower to accomplish this sort of thing. But if you've got lots of hands on deck, you've got a respiratory therapist, maybe even 2 respiratory therapists or something like that, then sure, if you've got manpower to spare, then this is probably going to be the best thing for your patient. Even if we haven't seen that long-term outcomes are different, if you really want to avoid any possible rate of hypoxemia in your patient, then this is the best thing you can do. In a spoonful, well, advice, at least for resource-rich environments, seems to be that going with non-invasive mask for preoxygenation is the best thing you can do. This is largely based on monitor-oriented outcomes. If you have the time and the manpower, like I said, this is probably the best thing you can do for your patients. However, for people that just don't think that this is feasible, then you shouldn't feel too bad about it because the benefit is not flagrant or obvious in terms of patient-centered outcomes. Now, of course, Preoxy did have some findings, but we've got to look at more than just Preoxy. Okay, and then we'll move on to the second article titled Hepatitis C Screening in Emergency Departments, the Detect Hep C Randomized Clinical Trial out of the JAMA. Now, hepatitis C rates have increased in recent decades largely due to the opioid epidemic. That's 4 million people in the United States right now and 13,000 deaths per year, despite us having a cure. But since if you have cirrhosis, then you have a 50% 5-year mortality, that we can't reverse. So we have to detect patients before they get to that late stage. And this is why the IDSA recommends that everyone be screened for hepatitis C at least once at some point, and even more if you're high risk. Now, of course, everybody kind of comes in the emergency department at some point, and we get all kinds of people who otherwise do not contact the medical system at all. And so people are always thinking about the emergency department as a great place for some kind of screening for high-risk individuals. These authors wanted to compare whether it was best to do just random screening and screen everybody, or do targeted screening and only screen people who are at high risk of having hepatitis C. Those targeted, those being at high risk that is, are those born between 1945 and 1965, if you're an IV drug user, if you're an intranasal drug user, if you've got some kind of shoddy tattoos or piercings from an unregistered place, they're probably referring mostly to people who get tattoos in prison. If you get hemodialysis, you've had transfusions, or you got a transplant before 1992. So this study was conducted at 3 high-volume American emergency departments, and they recruited almost 150,000 emergency department visits, which is incredible. Kudos to them for 24/7 enrollment. Now, interestingly, only 89% of those randomized were actually offered the screening. But I guess that's the emergency department for you, because it's always going to be a little bit hard for everybody. 22% of patients actually accepted, but only half of them completed the testing. And this led to a nearly 2% rate of new hepatitis C diagnoses. Now, for those in the targeted group, they did nearly half as much testing, but found nearly 50% more cases if they were only targeting those high-risk patients. Now, unfortunately, even after all of this, they've taken all these steps, they've screened, they've tested, they're making this diagnosis. Now we have to get those patients to treatment, and only 20% of the found cases were actually treated. A slightly higher rate of compliance in those patients who had the targeted testing done. Now, I'm not a huge public health wonk, but screening 150,000 patients and you only end up treating less than 50? That doesn't seem like very favorable numbers to me. In each of these groups, they only ended up treating around a little over 20 patients. This is not huge numbers here. And that's after screening, like I said, 150,000 patients, which is a huge number, or at least offering screening to this many people. They were, that's how many people were randomized. But that's how many people in total were kind of involved in this study. And you still treated less than 20 people. Yikes. So it wasn't completely obvious if there was a better method for screening here. I'd say since they did half as much testing that it's probably better to target the people who are actually at high risk. However, you still found a little bit more people if you just screened everybody, but obviously you're going to find more people if you screen everybody. Nowhere in the article did they mention the costs of doing any of this. It's hard to say really what to do with this. Hopefully the public health people will figure this one out. In a spoonful, non-targeted screening for hepatitis C virus in the emergency department when robustly performed identifies more cases of hepatitis C. I mean, well, duh, if you screen more, you'll find more. But was it really worth it with such a low yield of actually treating these patients? We've still clearly got a lot of work to do in terms of setting up these patients to actually be treated when we find them. So, in terms of the screening, it seems to be better to screen everybody, but clearly we still have a lot of steps to take. Okay, and that's all the articles that we have from this week. Let's do a quick wrap up of everything that we talked about. From the first article, we saw a network meta-analysis which compared non-invasive positive pressure ventilation versus high-flow nasal cannula for the preoxygenation of critically ill patients. Non-invasive therapy seemed to come out on top, at least for rates of hypoxemia, but it did not benefit mortality. From the second article, if you screen everybody, you're going to find more stuff, in this case, hepatitis C virus. However, we're not very good at going from screening to actual treatment, so we've got to work on that step, especially if we're going to make this a cost-effective intervention. If you were hearing this right now, then you were not a part of the members feed, and so you missed 3 articles from this past week. What were those articles that you missed? Well, there was one article where we talked about the risks of heat-related illnesses in the workplace, and then we talked about all the literature from 2024 as it relates to pharmacotherapy. And then finally, we looked at all the RCTs which have analyzed thrombectomy for large vessel occlusions with large cores. Links to all the original articles can be found at journalfeed.org or just follow those links in your show notes. Our goal here is for you to read less, learn more, and save lives, one spoonful at a time. Thank you.